In the quiet farmlands of Wisconsin, a boy spent his childhood chasing chickens, fixing tractors, and hunting rabbits. He was just another kid from the countryside, poor, quiet, and obsessed with machinery. But when World War II erupted across the Pacific, this same farm kid would become America's deadliest fighter ace, shooting down more enemy planes than anyone else. 40 Japanese aircraft, to be exact. His name was Major Richard Ira Bong, and his story sounds almost too impossible to be true. Richard Bong was born on September 24, 1920, in a small wooden farmhouse near Poplar, Wisconsin, a place where the world seemed to stand still. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, with the smell of pine and fresh soil filling the air. Life was simple, quiet, and hard. His father, Carl Bong, was a Swedish immigrant who worked the land with his bare hands, and his mother, Dora, kept the household together, raising 9 children through winters that seemed to last forever. Richard, the eldest of them all, learned early what discipline meant. Every morning before sunrise, he'd be out in the fields feeding the chickens, milking the cows, or helping repair fences that had given way under the snow. The cold bit at his fingers, but he never complained. Hard work wasn't just expected, it was survival. Yet, even in those early days, there was something different about Richard. While his brothers saw fields, he saw runways. While they dreamed of a good harvest, he dreamed of the open sky. He'd often stop in the middle of his chores whenever he heard the distant hum of an airplane engine. Back then, planes were rare in rural Wisconsin, mechanical birds of wonder that cut through the clouds like lightning. Richard would drop his tools and stare upward, his eyes following the silhouette until it disappeared. He wanted to know everything about them, how they flew, how they turned, how they stayed in the air at all. His mother used to laugh, telling neighbors that Richie will never keep his feet on the ground for long. But his fascination wasn't just with flying. It was with control. On the farm, control was life, controlling the plow, the animals, the machinery. Everything demanded precision. A loose grip or wrong angle could cost you a hand or a harvest. That discipline seeped into his bones. When he got his hands on a BB gun, he didn't just shoot cans, he studied them. He'd set up rows of tin cans at varying distances, testing himself, learning how wind and distance changed everything. He could hit the smallest targets from impossible ranges. He didn't know it then, but he was training for war. At night, he would sit by the window, reading books about aviation. He devoured everything, from early Wright brothers experiments to Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight. Lindbergh became his hero, a farm boy from Minnesota who had conquered the Atlantic. If Lindbergh could do that, why couldn't he? Richard began building model planes from scraps of wood and paper, gluing them together with determination that bordered on obsession. Sometimes, when the models broke, he'd fix them better than before, tinkering until they flew straighter and longer. When winter came and the farm quieted under thick snow, Richard's imagination only grew stronger. He'd watch the wind whip across the fields and picture himself cutting through it in a P-26 pea shooter or a Curtiss biplane. He wanted to be faster than the hawks that circled the barn, freer than the clouds above the pines. His family couldn't afford flying lessons. They could barely afford new boots. But Richard had patience. He knew that someday, somehow, he'd find a way to get off the ground. By his teenage years, Bong's confidence matched his skill. He was quiet, polite, and unassuming. But everyone in Poplar knew he was different. Teachers saw it in the way he focused. Friends saw it in his curiosity about how things worked. When other boys talked about baseball or cars, Richard was sketching the shapes of airplanes in his notebooks. He learned the physics of flight long before he ever sat in a cockpit. He often walked several miles to the nearest field just to watch male planes land. He'd study their movements carefully, how the pilots adjusted the wings, when they pulled up, how they braked. It was a sacred ritual to him. Those moments watching aircraft became his private classroom. Every detail he absorbed would one day translate into life-or-death instincts. Despite his quiet nature, he wasn't soft. Farm life had made him tough, physically strong, mentally steady, and impossibly patient. When a storm came, he didn't panic, he adjusted. When crops failed, he didn't quit, he replanted. That same resilience would later help him survive the chaos of the Pacific skies, where a single mistake meant death. When Bong finally left home for college at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, it wasn't to escape the farm. It was to take what it had taught him and aim higher. He carried with him every lesson from those fields: timing, patience, observation, and calm under pressure. The simplicity of his upbringing became the foundation for something far greater. Those who knew him back then never imagined that the shy, polite boy who spent hours staring at the sky would one day become the greatest American ace of all time. But in truth, his destiny had been written long before he ever saw combat. In the rhythm of the farm, the whistle of the wind, and the precision of every shot he took as a boy. Because while most kids dreamed of growing up and settling down, Richard Bong dreamed of growing wings. And when the world went to war, the boy who once chased birds across the Wisconsin sky would become the bird that every enemy pilot feared to see above them. He didn't arrive at the controls by accident. After graduating high school and enrolling at Superior State Teachers College, he signed up for the brand-new Civilian Pilot Training Program, a government effort run through colleges to turn mechanically minded kids into aviators. The first time he wrapped his hands around a control yoke in a little trainer, he recognized the language instantly. Pressure, trim, rudder. Each response as predictable as a plow in tough soil if you handled it right. He sat through ground school with the same quiet intensity he'd once reserved for seed catalogs and weather charts, memorizing airspeeds, the anatomy of a wing, and the way pressure slipped over the camber to make lift. He wasn't just passing tests, he was stockpiling instincts. On weekends, he squeezed in private lessons, often in a Piper J3 Cub that smelled of dope and fabric, oil and cut grass. The Cub's panel was simple, a few needles and a compass, and the airplane told you everything you needed to know through the seat of your pants. He learned to feel a sink before the needle fell, to catch a wing with rudder before it sagged, to hold the nose just so on short final and let the mains whisper onto the turf. By the time his classmates were still wrestling with coordinated turns, he was practicing slips to landing and laughing softly at how a breath on rudder could change everything. When the world darkened in 1941, he made the decision that surprised no one who had ever watched him watch the sky. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. The date went into the ledger, May 29, 1941, and the farm kid from Poplar stepped onto a westbound train bound for the sun-blasted fields of California. He left home with a duffel, a pocket notebook, and a habit of noticing small things: wind direction, cloud buildups, the way birds tucked a wing to turn, that would serve him better than any charm. Primary flight training started at Rankin Aeronautical Academy, where the air was hot, the schedule hotter, and the steerman biplanes barked like impatient dogs. The PT-17 didn't forgive laziness. It would ground loop if you got sloppy, and it would waggle its tail if you forgot to mind the rudder in a crosswind. He didn't get sloppy. He learned stalls as if they were just another chore. Reduce power, ease back, feel the buffet, recover smoothly. And he learned spins the way he'd learned to unstick a tractor. Don't fight the machine, understand it. His instructors noticed he didn't so much correct errors as prevent them from starting. He flew tight traffic patterns that looked drafted with a ruler and started to play with energy management on downwind, easing the throttle, trading altitude for speed, then speed for altitude, as if the airplane were a ledger to be balanced. Basic at Gardner Field moved him into the Vultee BT-13, a heavier, truer test of judgment. The BT-13 demanded planning. If you arrived high and hot, it made you pay with a long float. He learned to read the runway numbers like a contract, make the threshold or fix your approach, and he developed a habit of flying his base leg with just the right nudge of rudder to keep the ball centered, the kind of precision that keeps bullets on target months later. Formation flying arrived like a new dialect, eyes glued on the lead's elevator hinge, throttle hand alive. Tiny pressure changes keeping station as if invisible wires connected the airplanes. By now, the instructors were not just approving of him. They were studying him, how he trimmed, how little he moved the controls, how he kept his scan wide without letting the horizon wander. Advanced at Luke Field delivered the North American AT-6 Texan, the closest thing to a fighter you could get without a gun button. The Texan made you honest, mishandled the torque on takeoff, and it would yaw hard enough to teach you humility. He didn't mishandle it. He listened to the airplane, right rudder ready, tail up cleanly, lift off straight, and then climbed into a desert haze that turned the horizon into a pale, shimmering line. Gunnery began to migrate from chalkboard to reality. Deflection angles, closure rates, the dance between lead and lag. Camera gun footage replaced theory, and the graded film didn't care how charming you were. Only whether your pipper lived where physics said it must. In that arena, he did more than fine. He stood out. One veteran Czech pilot walked back into the ready room shaking his head, saying the kid in the back seat had this way of living on your six no matter what you tried. A shadow you couldn't shake. Another instructor, Captain Barry Goldwater, called him a bright gunnery student with that slippery, unteachable quality. Experienced pilots simply call feel. He took to the link trainer the way he'd taken to chores, deliberately, methodically. Inside the dark little box, with only needles to trust, he practiced radio ranges, procedure turns, and timed legs until his brain could fly a holding pattern while his hands seemed to operate independently. He learned to copy clearances fast and neat, to set the directional gyro exactly, and to make power pitch trim changes as a single flowing act. Instructors said he didn't fumble for the checklist so much as embody it. It wasn't showy. It was quiet competence, the sort that accumulates safety margins without stealing any speed. When he finally pinned on his wings in January 1942, it felt less like a graduation and more like a confirmation of something he'd been living toward since the first time he heard an engine hum over the fields. The Army noticed, too. Instead of shipping him straight out, Luke Field kept him around a while as a gunnery instructor, a young lieutenant teaching other young men how to put lead where geometry demanded. He flew hard, taught harder, and when Hollywood came asking for airplanes for the film Thunderbirds, he even slipped into the role of stunt pilot for a day. Another odd job in a season of relentless training. His first exposure to the twin-boom fighter that would make his name came soon after. Reassigned to Hamilton Field with the 14th Fighter Group, he strapped into the Lockheed P-38 for the first time. It was bigger, faster, and stranger than anything he'd flown. 2 engines, counter-rotating props, a cockpit perched between them like a hawk's head. He treated the checkout flight like a handshake with a powerful neighbor, respectful, curious, attentive to every quirk. In 40 minutes he'd sampled its climb, its roll, its split S, and felt the satisfying steadiness of nose-mounted guns you didn't have to harmonize. He stepped down from the ladder that day with a look that told everyone what he already knew. This was the machine he'd been growing toward. There were moments when his confidence colored outside the lines, the kind the brass would later swat down with a stern word. But even those episodes spoke less of recklessness than of intimacy with the airplane. How low you could go, how tight you could turn, how precisely you could place yourself in space. More important was what the instructors and check pilots kept repeating in different words. He flew smoothly, economically, with an economy of motion that preserved energy for when it mattered. You could see it in the way his approaches never hunted, in the way his gunnery tracks were steady rather than jittery, in the way he anticipated changes before they fully arrived. By the time orders finally pointed him toward a war half a world away, the farm lessons and the flight line lessons had fused. He knew how to manage a scarce resource: airspeed, altitude, ammunition, the way a farmer manages daylight. He knew when to push and when to wait. He knew that hitting a target wasn't magic. It was math practiced until it felt like instinct. And as he walked across the ramp toward the fighter that would carry him into legend, he did it with the quiet certainty of a man who'd already flown every critical second 100 times in his head. He met the lightning the way a farmhand meets a powerful draft horse, by walking slow, keeping a hand on the metal, learning its moods before asking it to work. 2 silver booms, a central pod like a hawk's head, and a cockpit with a steering yoke instead of a stick. Already different, already demanding respect. The props turned opposite ways, so the airplane didn't yank itself around on takeoff. At the top of their arc, the blades spun outward from the cockpit, which steadied the platform when you started shooting. He noted that like a man memorizing the field he'd plow at dawn. He learned the cockpit by touch, mixture, props, throttles, until his hands could set power without his eyes leaving the horizon. Twin Allison V-1710s sat in the booms like coiled muscle, their turbo superchargers breathing thin air, and, as a bonus, muting the exhaust so the airplane prowled more quietly than you'd expect from something so big. The first time he eased the throttles forward and felt the lightning rise on its nose wheel, he understood the promise: range to roam, altitude to choose the fight, and a second engine as insurance if luck ran thin. Gunnery changed from an act of aiming a gun to an act of flying the entire machine. All the teeth lived in the nose: 4.50 caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon, so there was no wing convergence gamble, no guessing where 2 streams would meet. You pointed the airplane, and the airplane pointed the bullets. With full loads, you could keep the 50s chattering for roughly half a minute, and the cannon for a brief, decisive burst, enough to end a duel if you used it with discipline. He practiced smooth tracking and learned to start his squeeze only when the pipper lived steady, not jittering, on the target. Later he would admit he didn't think of himself as a great shot, which is why he preferred to close, closer than most men dared, so that when he fired, the hits were certain. The lightning rewarded pilots who understood energy the way farmers understand daylight. With drop tanks fitted, she could lope far over ocean and jungle, then still climb hard when the time came to strike. Every knob and lever taught the same lesson: spend only what you must: airspeed, altitude, ammunition, and keep some in your pocket for the way home. He flew patterns until his approaches stopped hunting, until his flare felt like letting the airplane settle into its own shadow. and then he went back up to practice again. She had quirks, and he met them head-on. In a steep dive, the P-38 could trespass into compressibility, the nose tucking and the controls stiffening as if the air itself turned to glass. He studied the warnings, felt the buffet at speed, and learned the recovery. Manage the dive, use trim wisely, never chase a kill so hard you lost the airplane. He welcomed the later addition of dive recovery flaps that let a Lightning pull out cleaner from a high-speed plunge, and he appreciated the hydraulically boosted ailerons that arrived on late war machines, turning big wings into quick hands. But he never assumed a mod would save him. He flew like a man who knew where the edges were. At Hamilton Field, he and the P-38 began an unruly friendship. He learned the twin-engine takeoff dance. Tail light, right foot ready, keep it straight. And he explored the climb where the turbos made thin air feel thick. On the ground, he was courteous and quiet. In the air, he could be exuberant. Once, exuberance tipped into trouble. A low pass over a friend's house. A wild day when other pilots looped the Golden Gate, a fast run down Market Street that turned laundry into confetti. The reprimand came from General George C. Kenney himself, sharp but oddly approving, as if to say, "We need your fire. Just learn where to aim it." He did. What surprised him most wasn't the speed. It was the poise. The big fighter could be mishandled and forgive you, but flown well it became steady as a rifle bench. Counter-rotating props tamed torque on the roll. The wide stance and tricycle gear made landings precise instead of theatrical. He practiced single-engine work until the sight of a feathered prop didn't raise his pulse. Rudder in, bank into the good engine, nurse the power, keep the ball honest, and you'd bring her home. Many men would owe their lives to that second engine. He intended never to need it, but he knew exactly how to ask for its mercy, if he did. The airplane taught tactics as surely as any instructor. With its range and climb, he could arrive above the fight and choose when to spend his advantage. A slashing pass, a cold-eyed extension to rebuild energy, then back in. The muffled exhaust meant his first hint to an enemy was often a sparkle of tracers already walking toward him. He practiced holding his fire until the angle was honest, and the range was short enough that even a self-doubting marksman couldn't miss. It wasn't showy. It was mercilessly practical. Farm logic at fighter speed. He came to savor little truths only Lightning pilots collected. How the chin radiators on the J model gave the nose a pugnacious look and better cooling in the heat. How the yoke felt heavy in rough air, but went light and exact in the groove. How the nose gun's straight-line recoil nudged the airplane but didn't spoil the sight picture. How the cockpit's view, booms framing the world, made it easy to keep tally in a crowded sky. Each quirk became a strength as soon as he named it and trained to it. When orders finally pointed him at the Southwest Pacific, he didn't feel like a man being handed a famous machine. He felt like a man and machine already bound by a private language. He knew what the Lightning could do, what it would refuse to do, and where it demanded courage instead of cleverness. Out there, over green mountains and black water, he would test every lesson: range, patience, discipline, and the kind of close-range gunnery that turned a steady hand into a final sentence. The P-38 would make legends in that theater. He intended to be one of them. He learned the smell of the Southwest Pacific before he ever fired a shot. The mix of damp canvas, hot oil, and rain rotting the jungle at the edges of the Strip. Orders sent him west in 1942 to Australia and on toward New Guinea. Assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group under 5th Air Force. It wasn't a glamorous arrival. tents pitched in scrub, mess lines in red mud, and an air war defined as much by weather and distance as by the enemy. But the farm kid recognized the rhythm immediately. Daylight was a resource, tools were precious, and everything depended on how carefully you used both. Port Moresby's airfields were a sprawl of hacked-out runways, pierced steel planking that rang under tires, and dispersal bays carved into kunai grass. Schwimmer Airfield, 14-mile drome, sat a few miles inland, with tents tucked back from the strip and the Laloki River curling beyond the tree line. Crews slept light, boots at the cot's edge, because the only clock that mattered was the scramble bell. Dust in the dry season, axle-deep mud in the wet, and mosquitoes all year. The place felt less like a base than a dare. 38s were scarce at first, and the group was still converting. While the 9th waited on airplanes and parts, he was temporarily attached to the 39th Fighter Squadron of the 35th Fighter Group to learn the theater the hard way, by flying it. The veterans there taught him the names of the weather the way farmers name storms. Morning build-ups over the Owen Stanleys, noon anvils walking toward the ranges, evening squalls that could erase a horizon in a minute. They taught him the look of a zero at distance, how it sat in the sky a little too lightly, and the different swagger of an Army Oscar. He filed each lesson away like a field note. His first victories came fast, and they came in the middle of someone else's legend. On December 27, 1942, flying from 14-mile drome with the 39th, he joined a patrol led by Captain Tom Lynch toward Buna, where the ground fight chewed men up yard by yard. The formation crossed that ragged coastline under a low ceiling, spotted the glint and smoke of a Japanese raid, and dove. He slid in behind one fighter, held the pipper long enough to make the decision irreversibly true, and fired, then rolled to find the next. By day's end, he had downed a Mitsubishi A6M0 and a Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar, the first marks in a column that would eventually reach 40. The Silver Star followed, the habits that earned it, patience, discipline, closing to sure range, were already fixed. Life on the ground never got easier. Mechanics worked bare-armed in rain that turned tools slippery and electrical problems vindictive. Armorers wiped grit from feed trays by lantern light and cursed the way humidity found its way into everything. Pilots learned to think in maps. Dobodura to the east, Leh and Salamaua up the coast. The Owen Stanleys a wall you climbed or skirted depending on fuel, weather, and luck. If the day's job was escort, you learned to read the bomber's mood from the shape of their formations. If it was a sweep, you read the sea for the shadow of ships, and the sky for the thin pencil lines of contrails you didn't want to see. Everyone learned to count fuel twice. The distances in New Guinea could turn a good fight into a bad landing in the bush in the span of a minute. He rejoined the 9th Fighter Squadron once the P-38s arrived in strength, the group setting up at Schwimmer with its nose to the coast and its back to the mountains. The Lightning's range let them throw a shadow deep into enemy airspace. The theater taught a specific kind of courage, not the head-on duel, but the patience to sit high and quiet, to choose when to spend altitude and speed like money, and to leave before the fight turned to a knife fight the Zero wanted. The best days were clean, slashing passes that sent the formation home intact. The worst were thunderstorms that boxed you in so tight you could hear rain hammering the canopy like gravel. January 1943 proved what December had promised. Over Leh, he added more victories, and within days he crossed the threshold every fighter pilot privately measures himself against. Ace. There was no celebration, just another line in a notebook, a hand on a crew chief's shoulder, and a quiet meal in the mess tent that tasted like wood smoke and fatigue. The war was a long ledger, and he had learned to enter only what mattered. If there was romance to the Pacific, it lived only in the photographs sent home. The reality was the hard geometry of missions: time to climb, time to coast, time to fight, time to turn for base before the jungle decided your fate. He memorized coastlines and ridge lines the way he'd once memorized fence lines and tree rows on the farm. The airplane became an extension of that memory. 2 engines to lean on, guns that looked where the nose looked, and a cockpit that taught him to stay calm when the world outside tried to tilt and blur. By late winter, the names in his debriefs, Buna, Leh, Salamaua, had stopped being dots on a map and become places with weather and habits. The routine had its own brutal grace. Wake to the sound of someone's cough in the next tent. Shave with cold water. Brief under a tarp that snapped and bellied in the wind, and then walk out to a fighter that could carry you hundreds of miles into a sky where victory and loss could happen in the same minute. The Pacific had welcomed him in its own way, by trying to break him, and he had answered in the only way he knew, by learning it, piece by piece, until the edges stopped being dangerous and started being useful. And in that harsh classroom, mud runway, hot engines, sullen clouds, he began to write the part of his story that no one could mistake for luck. At first he called it nothing at all, just the way he preferred to fight. Only later would other pilots try to name it. It began with altitude, always altitude, because altitude was time, and time was the one commodity that changed any fight into your fight. He'd climb until the horizon went thin and pale, and the coastline looked like a pencil line. Then he'd level just outside the enemy's attention, letting the lightning lope along on long legs while he studied. He wasn't hunting airplanes, he was hunting habits. The lazy arc a patrol flew when the leader got comfortable. The tiny drift a wingman made when his eyes slid to his instruments, the way a formation tilted, imperceptibly, when the sun was at its 6. He would wait until those habits fixed themselves into a pattern. Then he'd pick one airplane, a straggler by 100 yards, a man who flew wide in a turn, and decide. He never tried to make the P-38 do what a Zero did better. No flat turns, no prolonged scissors, no prideful knife fighting. The Lightning's great gift wasn't the prettiest turn, it was the vertical. He used it like a ladder. From above and behind, he'd ease the throttles forward and shape the dive long before anyone knew he was there. If the angle looked wrong or the target tightened up unexpectedly, he'd coldly break off and spiral back up, patient as a hawk. But when the angle was right, he made himself heavy. He let gravity build the speed. The twin Allisons took the hint and sang. The world pitched forward. The target grew fast. The trick, if there was one, lived in what he didn't do. He didn't rush the shot. He didn't twitch at the first glimpse of a canopy. He didn't shoot and hoped. He used everything he'd practiced with camera gun film until it sat in his hands like a reflex. Led for angle off. Add a breath more for closure. Settle the pipper not on the fuselage, but just ahead of where the engine would be when the bullets arrived. His finger took the slack out of the trigger in the same slow way he'd squeezed a .22 back on the farm. And he held the sight picture with a stubbornness that looked like calm from the outside and felt like iron on the inside. He liked to be so close that the nose guns weren't painting guesses, they were drawing lines. The Lightning made that possible. With all the firepower in the nose, 4.5s and the 20mm cannon. A steady track was a laser for its time. No wing convergence to gamble on, no crossing streams to harmonize. You flew the airplane onto the target and let the target fly into your bullets. He'd start with a short surgical burst, just enough to see a wink of strikes at the wing root or engine cowling. Then, only if the picture held, he'd press a second and finish it. 1 second. Sometimes less. The cannon's thud under his boots told him when it counted. There were days when he throttled back in the last seconds of the dive, not to go silent, not for drama, but to buy time. Closure in a lightning could turn savage. One heartbeat, you were 300 yards away, and the next you were inside 100, with the angle changing under your hands. A quick pull of the props and a smooth ease on the throttles bled just enough speed to lengthen the tracking window from a blink to a breath. A breath was plenty for a man who trusted a steady sight more than a lucky one. Coming off the shot was its own discipline. The worst sin in that theater was fixating, staring at wreckage, or chasing a wounded airplane down to where the Zero's advantage waited. Low, slow, and turning. As soon as his burst ended, he rolled clean, picked a compass line that slanted away from the sun, and climbed. 2 engines meant he could take his victory out of range of retribution faster than most, and he used that gift like a miser. If his wingman's call was tight, brake, brake, he'd jink hard and trade some speed for survival. But most of the time, good geometry was better than good reflexes. He was already moving back to where the next decision would be his. He studied sun angles the way a navigator studies stars. If you came out of the sun, the first hint the enemy got was usually the quiet thread of tracers already walking toward him. But the sun wasn't just a place to hide. It was a way to steal seconds. An attacker surfacing out of glare forced a defender to blink, and a blink was the margin he needed to make his 1-second burst decisive. On cloudy days, he made the weather do the same work, rolling out of a shadow so that his silhouette didn't register until it mattered. Deflection shooting, mysterious to many, was to him just farming arithmetic done at 400 miles an hour. Angle off was how far the target's path leaned away from him. Closure was how fast that lean would carry the airplane through his sight. Distance was the time fuse that sat between the muzzle and the metal he intended to break. Put simply, the more the target crossed your nose, the more you aimed ahead of it. The faster you were closing, the more you had to lay that sight out in front. The farther away you fired, the more error had time to grow teeth. He solved all 3 at once by refusing to fire at far range. He closed until the math got small enough to live with. Back at the Strip, those choices showed up on the camera gun film in ways even the greenest pilot could read. In a good pass, the track line sat steady. The pipper didn't vibrate like a startled bird. The first sparks hit in a cluster, not scattered like buckshot. He'd sit with the young ones in a tent that smelled of wet canvas and watch their film, grunting softly when they jinked their aim or fired from too far away, pointing with a pencil when a pause would have let the sight settle. He never turned critique into theater. He'd just say, "Closer," and then, "Hold it longer than you think you can," and let the film do the persuading. His crew chief noticed the downstream effects. When a man aims at cockpits in a panic, the armorers come home empty and swear at the skies. When a man aims at engines with patience, the armorers come home counting belts. The belts still emptied. Combat made pigs of ammunition. But his returned with a pattern. Fewer wild gaps, fewer burned-through barrels, more neat, short runs. The chief pasted kill stickers under the cockpit and joked that he should paint a stopwatch next to the girl on the nose. The tactic adapted itself to every mission type. On escort, with bombers trudging toward Leh or Wewak, he worked the top cover like a shepherd, letting enemy fighters climb toward the formation's flanks before dropping in to break up a pincer or snatch a hungry Zero off the edge. He never loitered at bomber altitude if he could help it. Down there, you caught the fight on the enemy's terms. Up high, he owned the first move, and first moves killed more men than last stands. On fighter sweeps, the pattern was more predatory. He and his wingman ran a lazy S above the coast until they teased a patrol into showing itself. Then they slid into their separate dives, one to strike, one to cover, switching roles on the climb like gears meshing. No chatter. 2 calls if the world went crooked. Tally for the sighting. Break for the emergency. Anything else took brains away from hands. There were shots he refused, and that restraint kept him alive. A head-on looked gallant and sometimes necessary, but he didn't like the math. Too many bullets trading places with too little time to move. A low tail chase invited ground fire, and ground fire killed aces as efficiently as rookies. A tail chase through a cloud bank looked exciting on film, and ended with airplanes colliding out of sight of their own nerves. He picked the fights that fit the Lightning and fit his own temperament. 1 pass, maximum violence, then upstairs to count what was left. On days when the sky turned treacherous, build-ups like dark towers, rain hammers beating the canopy, he added another layer to the method. Speed in rain vanished faster than a man's courage. The Lightning's broad wings drank energy and begged you to keep pouring more in. He'd go to auto-rich, keep a little extra prop, and refuse the temptation to yank. Smooth pressure saved airplanes. He'd learned that in training, when instructors said, "Never chase the nose in a dive," and meant, "Don't let your fear of the ground ruin your recovery." In the P-38, compressibility lurked like a trap at the bottom of a fast plunge. He primed his recovery before the dive began. Trim, mental picture, a limit in his head beyond which he would not chase a kill. And that meant he came home with an airplane intact, and a habit his enemies never got the chance to unteach. He didn't believe in lucky streaks, but he did believe in rhythm. There were mornings when the air felt thin and clean, and the first pass turned into smoke like a script. There were afternoons when every approach looked off by a degree, and he had to force himself to climb away, rather than press a bad bet. On those afternoons, he let the others tangle if they wanted, and took the flight home in good order. It wasn't timidity. It was the same farm sense that tells you not to cut hay under a sky that smells like lightning. Word spread, quietly, the way real things spread, about the Wisconsin kid who didn't waste bullets and didn't waste airplanes. New pilots started asking him the question that always came in different words and meant the same thing. What's the trick? He told them there wasn't one. Then, because they needed something to carry into the next mission, he gave them a list that sounded simple enough to insult, but was hard enough to save lives. Be above them. See them first. Don't turn with them. Close more than you think you should. Shoot less than you want to. Leave before you're tempted to stay. The enemy tried to adjust. Patrols tightened their spacing. Leaders started weaving more. Zeros climbed steeper under cover of cloud, hoping to meet his dive with a head-on flash and a mutual kill. He adjusted back. He lengthened his initial run-in so he could slant into them from a high side. He changed altitudes and bearings between passes so no one could aim blind at the ghost that kept arriving out of nowhere. He trained his wingmen to protect the climb, because the climb was where the method lived or died. Every once in a while, the fight collapsed into chaos anyway, the geometry blown to bits by surprise, loss, or luck, and he found himself lower than he liked with a zero cutting across his nose, and nothing left but reflex. The farm boy who loved neat solutions gave way, for a heartbeat, to the hunter who could put lead into a darting target at pistol-shot range. He let the lightning's nose swing, hauled a fraction of lead, and took the kind of burst that never looked elegant on film, but ended the argument. Then came the roll, the climb, the return to the rhythm he trusted. By the time the tally marks crept into double, then doubled again, the trick had acquired a reputation it never asked for. It wasn't a gimmick or a party piece. It was a system built from patience, gravity, discipline, and a lifetime of learning to keep your hands steady when the world asked you not to. Others could copy parts of it. Some did, and lived because they tried. But the whole, how he chose, how he waited, how he aimed, how he left, stayed his alone. If there was a secret at the heart of it, it was this. He never confused courage with compulsion. Courage took him down the ladder. Compulsion would have kept him there. He climbed. Again and again, he climbed. They started calling the strip a factory because it seemed to produce aces as reliably as it produced sorties, one day at a time, with sweat for machinery. By 1943, he had found his pace in New Guinea. Wake before the light, brief under a flapping canvas, then climb into the whitened sky until the world shrank to rivers like threads and mountains like rumples in a blanket. The P-38 gave him reach, but it was his patience that made the reach mean something. He waited above a fight the way a hunter waits above a clearing, nose tucked a few degrees off the sun, watching for the small mistake, the wide turn, the inattentive wingman. And when he saw it, he spent the altitude like money. The names in his log turned from place names into weather. Gasmata, with its heat shimmer, lay with the afternoon buildups that arrived like gates slamming, Salamaua with winds that leaned on your wing in the pattern. The ground war crawled along those coasts and ridges, and the air war draped itself over that crawl. He had learned in his first weeks that nothing killed more pilots than distance. Fights that looked clean in the middle became survival math at the edges, where fuel went from fine to not fine in a minute. So he learned the map by feel and the timetable by habit, and when he went hunting, he kept a corner of his mind for the way home. Victories began to gather. A fast reconnaissance Dinah brought down over Gasmata in October 1943 proved what he already suspected, that the Lightning's nose guns turned patience into mathematics. Later that month, and into early November, he joined the long, bruising series of strikes against Rabaul, that armored hornet's nest of an airfield where Zeros rose in angry clusters. He sent several down in those fights and came home with the same quiet face he wore at breakfast. There was no strut in it. He recorded the day, the type, the place, and moved on. The scoreboard below his cockpit sprouted little rising suns the crew chief pasted on with the same care he used for safety wire. In December, he was sent stateside on leave, a brief thaw back in Wisconsin, where snow settled on fence posts the way ocean haze settles on jungle hills. He came back to the Southwest Pacific early in 1944, not as a line pilot posted to a single squadron, but as a prized asset. 5th Air Force pulled him into fighter command to teach gunnery. It sounded like a desk with wings, but the fine print was better. He could fly missions to see how his students did, and if combat came to him, he could answer. He had never needed to go looking for fights. They had a way of presenting themselves to a man who understood where to stand. Through February and March 1944, he stacked more victories onto the ledger. Japanese bombers and fighters over New Britain and New Guinea, ambushes broken, and raids spoiled. Each success threw a little more light onto the method. Stay high, pick your problem, make one violent pass, and climb out before the sky turned to a knife fight. Then came April 12, 1944, over Hollandia. 3 kills in a single day, 3 perfectly timed bursts and 3 columns of smoke carried him past a number other Americans had treated as a ceiling since World War I. Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 was history. His tally read 27 by sundown. The math meant something to the newspapers, but what it meant to him was simpler. The method still worked when the stakes were loud. General George Kenney promoted him. The press called him what they always called the man on top, ace of aces, and the Army hustled him back to the States to speak at training fields and sell war bonds. He did the talking because he was told to, but everyone who met him remarked on the contradiction. A quiet man explaining violence like a craftsman explaining a tool. The tour ended. The war hadn't. He returned in September 1944, this time to the Philippines campaign, wearing new rank on his shoulders and a new constraint on his orders. Teach gunnery, fly to observe, do not seek combat. It might have tamed another pilot. It didn't tame him, it refined him. From Tacloban on Leyte, he launched in P-38s that ran like predators over Ormoc Bay and the shipping lanes where Japan tried to feed a dying army. He kept the same rules. Above them, see them first. 1 pass, climb. Only now he was the man the younger pilots watched out of the corner of their eyes, because he seemed to arrive in the right place, at the right second, with the right picture in his sight. Between October 10th and mid-November, he knocked down 8 more enemy aircraft in a string of sorties over Borneo and Leyte, Irving night fighters, Oscars, Tojos, and bombers that never made it to the beaches, and the campaign bent a little toward Allied hands. The airplane itself had become part of the story. The crew had pasted the yearbook portrait of his Wisconsin sweetheart, Marjorie Ann Vattendahl, onto the nose of one of his P-38s and lettered the name Marge in red script beneath. The photograph weathered sun and rain, peeled and was reapplied, and became, without any committee's permission, war's oddest combination of brutal and tender. Ground men swore the picture gave luck. He shrugged and said she gave him a reason to be careful. The cameras loved it. The enemy didn't. Teaching never stopped. He graded film with his students in tents that smelled of glue and damp canvas, pointed with a pencil where their tracers walked wide, showed them how a held breath steadied a pipper, and made them listen to the part of themselves that wanted to take a longer beat before firing. He showed them film of his own passes, short, decisive bursts that started only when the sight picture was done settling. "Closer," he would say, and then, "Leave as soon as you want to stay." They repeated the lines to each other like superstition, and discovered, to their surprise, that superstition worked when it was just discipline spoken in a softer voice. By November 15th, he had stacked 36 aerial victories across the ledger of the Pacific. The paperwork began to move faster than airplanes. Kenney sent a recommendation up the chain, and on December 12, 1944, at Tacloban, General Douglas MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on his tunic. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism in a run of missions from October 10th to November 15th. He didn't keep the medal in his pocket for long. Ceremonies made him restless. He returned to the flight line the way a farmer returns to a field after the neighbors have left, quietly, and with a mind for the work at hand. The last days of the year wrote the last lines of his combat ledger. On December 7th, he struck again, 2 in a day while covering landings around Ormoc. On the 15th, another Oscar fell. On December 17th, 1944, flying from Leyte, he scored his 40th victory near Mindoro. No drum roll, no speech, just the steady thud of the 20mm, a flash of strikes where an engine should have been, and then the disciplined rollout and climb he had practiced since New Guinea. The number mattered to history. What mattered to him was that he had done it without ever betraying his own rules. He brought the airplane home. He found the crew chief. He debriefed. He ate. He slept. The Pacific moved on. Men tried to define what they had watched. Some said he was fearless. He wasn't. Fearless pilots die of debts they didn't count. Others said he had a gift for gunnery. He disagreed, telling anyone who asked that his aim only looked good because he refused to shoot from far away. The truth lived somewhere quieter. He had a gift for timing, for putting his airplane and his nerve into the same second, and for ending the second while it still belonged to him. That gift, multiplied by the patience of a man raised to count daylight and hold it, turned a remote jungle strip into an assembly line for survival, and turned a farm kid into a benchmark other pilots would chase and not catch. By the time orders pulled him off combat status for good, the factory had made what it came to make. Not a myth, but a method anyone could learn if they were stubborn enough to keep their hands steady and their pride small. He had flown through 2 full years of the hardest theater in the world, and ended them not with a victory roll, but with a habit. Engine switches by touch. Canopy latch checked twice. Last glance at the horizon for the weather tomorrow. And where the scoreboard below his cockpit had once been an empty panel, the rising suns stood row on row, neat as fence posts after harvest, testifying to a simple arithmetic done well and repeated until the war itself changed shape around it. He carried her in his pocket long before her portrait rode the nose. The photograph, black and white, schoolbook simple, lived folded in the map case beside his checklist and a stub pencil. When the tent lamps burned low and the jungle sounded like a place trying to heal itself, he'd unfold it and let his eyes settle. Marjorie Ann Vatndal was the opposite of New Guinea. Clear, clean lines. A smile that didn't ask anything from you. Light instead of heat. They had met in Superior, Wisconsin, when his life still smelled like cut hay and gasoline, and their courtship began the old way. Walks, shared jokes, a bundle of letters that grew heavy with time. War turned that softness into a lifeline. The first time the ground crew pasted her face onto his fighter, it started as a joke. Give the kids something to fly home to. But it became a ritual. The Lightning's nose was a blunt, perfect canvas. Someone borrowed the photo, sketched her outline in charcoal, and then brought her to life with enamel in colors that somehow survived the sun. Over time, rain lifted edges, dust scuffed the sheen, and the mechanics would touch it up with the same care they used on safety wire and cotter pins. He didn't put his hands on it before takeoff. He wasn't that kind of superstitious. But he walked past it slower than he needed to, the way a farmer lingers a second at the gate even when he's late. Mail arrived in avalanches or not at all. When it came in bundles. V-mail sheets thin as onion skin, envelopes with censors ink like little storms that had rained out the details. Polaroid corners softened by handling. She wrote about home, lake wind on the Superior hillside, first snow on the cedars, a local dance that felt smaller without him. He wrote back about everything except what he couldn't. The way an engine ticked cool after landing. The joy of finding a clean horizon when storms tried to pen you in. The polite ferocity of the P-38 when its guns lived steady on a target. He sent no details the censors would cut because he refused to give the war one more thing to chew. He sent impressions instead, and the shape of missing her. Marge became more than paint. New arrivals asked whose girl was on the sharp end of that twin-boom machine. Old hands would say, "The reason he flies, like he's got something to keep." The crew chief taped a small copy of the photo inside the cockpit, below the gun sight, far enough not to distract, close enough to count. It wasn't a shrine, it was an anchor. Out over water, where haze could turn the world into a blank promise, he sometimes caught the edge of that picture in his periphery and felt his hands soften their grip. Patience was easier when home had a face. Fame was the tax on survival. Reporters started to arrive, sweating in ties that didn't belong in the tropics, asking about the girl on the nose. He deflected, as if the attention itself were a gust he could fly around. Still, the story moved faster than he did. Farm boy, ace, sweetheart named Marjorie. And soon the photograph on the airplane was in newspapers he never had time to read. In the evenings he'd sit on an ammo crate while a radio scratched stateside music into the jungle and imagine her hearing the same song with winter tapping on a window. He didn't promise glory in his letters. He promised coffee at a small kitchen table, his jacket on a chair, the sky safely back where it belonged. Above them, not around them. During the brief furlough back home, the distance dissolved and all the strange light of fame fell away. Wisconsin looked exactly as it should. Snow raw at the edges, where boots had scuffed it, breath pluming in sentences that didn't need to be said out loud. He walked with her down streets he had memorized with his bicycle years earlier and felt a slow, surprising calm, as if the map of his life had finally unfolded to the part where two roads met. They laughed about the absurdity of his face on posters and hers on a fighter. She teased him about the way he ruined gloves by tinkering. He teased her about the way she could empty a room of its noise just by standing in it. They made plans the way the practical make plans. Dates, places, a list of things that weren't to be left to chance. By early 1945, they were married in Superior. A winter ceremony bright with the sort of joy that doesn't require large crowds. He wore the uniform because he owned little else that fit, and because, in that moment, it felt less like a costume and more like a bridge between the life he had and the life he wanted. Friends said they looked like a postcard. He thought it looked like a starting line. They had a handful of days that tasted like peace, coffee that didn't come from a mess tin, conversations that didn't have to end because a briefing did. And then the war put its hand on his shoulder. Orders came. He went. She held the door, and then the memory of the way he turned, once, in the cold, to wave as if he were counting the seconds of a perfect pass. Work changed shapes the way light does. After the tally reached a number, the brass considered enough for one man. More than enough. They pulled him from the sharp end. He did not argue. He had carried his luck carefully for a long time, and knew thrift when he saw it. They sent him stateside, and then west to California, where the air over the San Fernando Valley held a new sound and a new smell. Turbo supercharger, wine, and hot oil gave way to something steadier, lower, as if the sky itself had found a different gear. Jet airplanes were no rumor now. They were silver facts rolling out of hangars with their noses high and their exhausts black with promise. He met the P-80 Shooting Star the way he had met the Lightning, hand to metal, eyes on angles, respect first. Early jets were honest and unforgiving in different places than piston fighters. The throttle didn't flick the airplane into speed so much as invite it. Spool-up lag meant you planned your next 10 seconds before you asked for them. The prop wash that made tail surfaces lively on a P-38 was gone. Control at low speed had to be earned with airspeed, not noise. Brakes mattered differently. So did pattern altitude. He listened to instructors younger than he was and nodded at lessons that contradicted nothing he already knew. Don't rush the rotation. Don't chase the nose. Put yourself where the airplane wants to be before it demands it. The first time the runway unwound under the jet like a ribbon being pulled, He felt the future take hold. Acceleration didn't shove, it gathered. The world smoothed out at speeds where lightning still had edges. Climb came on with an ease that felt like cheating. Yet for all the grace, he recognized old traps hiding in new corners. The temptation to let the jet fly you instead of the other way around. The way a long, hot day could turn braking distances into prayers. The imperative to manage energy with the same thrift he had practiced over the Bismarck Sea. He applied farm sense to space-age hardware. Count what you have, spend what you must. Keep a little for the worst minute of the day. His assignment demanded calm showmanship. He flew acceptance hops, test cards, and demonstrations for groups of officers who measured the future in knots and climb rates. He spoke to classrooms full of cadets with fresh wings about the way jets changed not the principles, but the penalties. Plan earlier, commit cleaner. Respect how fast a small mistake becomes a large one. When someone asked whether a jet could make an average pilot great, he said what he always said in different words. Airplanes don't forgive like that. They pay out exactly what you put in. Between flights, he read dispatches from the Pacific and felt the confusing twin pull of gratitude and guilt. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He traced the map with his finger, finding airfields where he had once slept and seas he had once crossed in a cockpit that smelled like cordite. Friends' names appeared in letters that told of wounds and rotations, and sometimes didn't mention a name again at all. He wrote to Marjorie every night he could, telling her about the way the jet's shadow looked on the runway, about the strange quiet of a sky without propellers, about people who stopped him on the street to thank him for things he didn't feel he had done alone. She wrote back about small domestic miracles, ripe fruit, a borrowed book, an afternoon that felt like a promise kept. The public wanted a hero. He tried to hand them a craftsman instead. At Bond rallies he spoke briefly, without theatrics, about engines and maintenance, about the way a good crew chief could save more pilots than a good speech, about the cost of stones in the gravel where tires rolled. People applauded anyway. He shook hands until his knuckles ached, then drove back to the field where checklists waited, where the wind sock told the day's truth, where the next takeoff always felt like the next honest thing. What he missed from combat wasn't danger, it was clarity. In the Pacific, the mission wrote your day and your choices. In California, the war seemed both bigger and farther away, a storm you heard through a wall. He understood why he had been pulled. Math and mercy, the Air Force preserving a symbol as much as a man, but he also knew symbols don't sleep. They only stare back when the room gets quiet. When that happened, he turned to the only antidote he trusted: preparation. He studied the emergency procedures until the cards went soft at the edges. He practiced flame-out approaches until the numbers felt like muscle. He taught what he learned the day he learned it, so that no lesson lived in only one cockpit. Outside, the world inched toward ending the war by inches, and then by gulfs. Newspapers carried names of islands that had once been whispers. Radio voices spoke in the even tones of men who understood the weight of news. He and Marjorie stole hours when they could, phone calls bridged by long silences that said more than words, quick visits punctuated by train schedules and salutes. They built a tiny life inside the large one the country kept insisting on handing them. In that small life were the things he had promised in letters: ordinary breakfasts, a chair that creaked the same way every time, a front door that remembered how he swung it open. In the hangar, the jet cooled with the same ticking he had heard from a dozen airplanes in a dozen climates, metal talking to air. He stood by the wing and watched heat shimmer into nothing. thinking about a farm road in Wisconsin that ran straight for a mile and then bent toward trees. The bend was coming, he knew. The war would end suddenly and then slowly. He didn't know which day would be the last day of it, only that when it came, he wanted to be exactly where he had always tried to be, doing the work in front of him with a steady hand and going home to the person whose name was written on the nose of every good thing he'd ever flown. The morning came on clear over the San Fernando Valley, the kind of bright California day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. He walked across the ramp at the Lockheed Air Terminal with the same deliberate calm he'd brought to jungle strips and island fields, checklist folded, mind steady. The P-80A, sleek, high-shouldered, impatient, waited at the edge of the concrete like a promise. Acceptance flight? Short card? Nothing dramatic. He had just a handful of hours in this new animal, 4 hours and a quarter by the ledger, enough to prove what he already understood. Jets didn't change the laws of flying, just the penalties for breaking them. He climbed the ladder, settled in, and made the cockpit small and orderly. Hands on the familiar sequence, eyes on the pressure and heat that meant the world was ready to move. Wheels rolled, nose came light, and the runway unwound beneath him. Then, the moment that separates memory from history, an engine that should have kept gathering the day instead coughed it back. The main fuel pump starving the J-33 when he needed it most. The jet sagged, rolled, then kept rolling. Training rose like a reflex. No panic, just actions. He tried to save the airplane, then made the harder choice to save himself. He jettisoned the canopy and bailed out. Low, far too low for a chute to do what chutes are meant to do. On the ground below, on the quiet grid of North Hollywood streets, people looked up at the sudden sound and saw a silver shape meet earth at the corner of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue, the acceptance flight ending in flame. It was around 2:45 in the afternoon. In the confusion afterward, stories tried to knit themselves into explanation. The jet's primary fuel pump had failed. A brand-new auxiliary pump, added after an earlier accident, could have fed the engine if it were switched on in time. Some said he didn't reach it. Others said he forgot it in a second that offered no grace. For those who knew him, the second-guessing was unhelpful and beside the point. He had always counted risks carefully, husbanded luck carefully, and met emergencies with a craftsman's economy. On this day, the new math of the jet age left no margin. The nation read the news that evening alongside an even larger headline from the other side of the Pacific, the bombing of Hiroshima, and absorbed both shock and sorrow in a single breath. The Wire's stories struggled to hold two truths at once: that the war's end had rushed nearer, and that America's ace of aces would not live to see it. His young wife, Marjorie, 21, learned as families learn, by telephone and the voices of people trying to do a hard job gently. Friends gathered without needing to be asked. On flight lines from Leyte to Leh, men who had flown under his shadow or under his teaching looked at the sky in a new way, as if the color had shifted. A funeral followed quickly, August. 8 at Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior, and then the long road out to Poplar Cemetery, the same country roads he had once bicycled as a boy. There, in a plot that faced the wind off the lake, they set him down under a piece of Wisconsin sky that would always know his name. What followed was not erasure, but engraving. Time did not soften the number 40. It deepened it. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, a record that never needed adjective or apology. The Medal of Honor he had accepted in December 1944 remained a fact of the nation's gratitude, but the citation read like a careful sketch of the man. A gunnery instructor who insisted on going back up, a leader who volunteered for the dangerous missions because the dangerous missions needed doing, a pilot who made discipline look like instinct. On the day the medal was pinned to his tunic by General Douglas MacArthur, he had stood quiet, not because the honor was small, but because it was large, and he knew large things should be met with few words. At home, people set about the work of remembering with the same practicality he had valued. In Superior, they built the Richard the Fern Bong Veterans Historical Center and filled it with the ordinary miracles of service: letters, gear, photographs, stories you could hold in your hand, and with a single extraordinary life threaded through them like a keel. Schoolchildren learned that the ace of aces had been a farm kid first, and that the virtues of a good farmer, patience, thrift, timing, could shape a pilot as surely as hours in a cockpit. Visitors learned that history, to be true, has to be local. It has to have an address you can drive to and a door you can open. Across the bay, engineers paid him a different sort of tribute: steel, concrete, and a tied arch drawn across St. Louis Bay to bind Superior to Duluth. The Richard the Fur Bong Memorial Bridge opened in the fall of 1984, long and level and confident, a crossing that turned two towns into one conversation. Drivers still speak of the way it lifts you above the water and then returns you to the ordinary streets of the world, which is its own metaphor for the difference between combat and home. It does what a memorial should. It carries people safely from one side to the other and reminds them quietly why such passages matter. Farther south, in the flat expanse of Kenosha County, a different dream was started, and then unstarted. The Air Force once intended to build a base there and name it for him. The jet age moved too fast for the plan to keep up, and the airfield never poured its runway. Wisconsin made of that pause something useful: a state recreation area with his name on the signs and the sky wide above it, a place for families to walk and watch the weather and think about the odd turnings of history. The land remembers in its own way. The airplane with Marjorie's face on the nose, the P-38 called Marge, became a legend within the legend. It was not the airframe he flew last or most, but it carried the story people love to tell. A sweetheart's portrait turned into a talisman of survival. Decades later, when preservationists and historians pushed through jungle heat in Papua New Guinea and found the remains of a lightning down in a ravine, engines buried nose first, the metal weathered to the color of old rain, the possibility that it was Marge made the news again. Not because wreckage changes what we know, but because a fragment in the leaves can anchor a whole life in a single square of earth. His legacy runs on smaller roads, too. At Poplar, there is a grave that receives visitors in every season. Veterans who stand with hands behind their backs, and teenagers who have just learned to drive, and parents who explain, in simple language, who he was. There are street names and plaques, items in museum cases, 1,000 quiet references in books and footnotes. There are also, less visibly, the habits he taught that outlived him. Be above them. See them first. Shoot less than you want to. Leave before you're tempted to stay. Those rules fit more things than dogfights. They fit lives. People who study such things will tell you his success came down to timing and discipline, arriving out of the sun when the other man had just blinked, holding the Pipper one heartbeat longer than seemed possible, firing only when math and patience agreed. People who knew him will tell you something gentler, that he kept his pride small, his attention large, and his promises. He married the girl whose picture he carried. He did the work that was put in front of him. He went where he was sent without confusing stubbornness for courage. If you want to understand his story without numbers at all, you can stand on the Duluth hillside and watch the Bong Bridge throw a long, clean line toward Wisconsin. You can walk the floors of the Veterans Center in Superior and listen to the hush of a museum where memory is not a performance, but a trust. You can step through the poplar cemetery when the wind is up and hear the pines make a sound like far-off surf. And you can think about a young man who learned to read the sky before he ever left the ground. There is no way to add an 11th hour to a life. There is only the way we carry the hours a man had, and the way we spend the daylight in ours. He did not live to see August 6, 1945, turn into evening, but he lives easily in the distance between a runway and a horizon, in the long patience of a steady hand, in the knowledge that skill can be trained and instinct cannot. Somewhere inside every good landing and every disciplined burst and every careful choice to climb instead of stay is the shape of his legacy. The farm boy's calm that made a craftsman a warrior, and the warrior's restraint that made a man worth remembering.